tell me what's in those bags. Right now.
I don't need to tell you anything. This is my apartment.
I've seen the people coming and going. Different faces every week. I know what this is.
What exactly do you think this is?
You're running something out of this
Running
unit.
something? Like what?
I've called the police. They're on their way.
Explain what? That we're meeting for group
I
therapy?
don't care what story you've come up with.
I want
us.
On the evening of May 18th, 2024, in a quiet residential building in Silver Spring, Maryland, landlord Kenneth Brennan made a decision that would cost him his career, his reputation, and over $2 million. What started as a routine Saturday evening, veterans arriving for their weekly PTSD support group, ended with police surrounding a decorated Navy SEAL, a viral video with over 40 million views, and a federal lawsuit that would force changes across the entire property management industry. Because the man Kenneth Brennan decided to racially profile that night wasn't just a tenant minding his own business. He was Marcus Williams, a 15-year Navy SEAL veteran with 3 combat tours, 2 Bronze Stars, and a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping veterans who came home from war only to face a different kind of battle. And the 6 men Kenneth accused of being part of a drug operation? They were Iraq and Afghanistan combat veterans struggling with PTSD, some of them homeless, all of them just trying to stay alive. Kenneth thought calling the police would get rid of the problem. Instead, it made him the problem. By the end of that night, body cam footage from 4 responding officers had been flagged by Internal Affairs. By the end of that week, Kenneth had been fired and the building ownership was under federal investigation. And by the time the lawsuit settled 8 months later, Marcus Williams had won one of the largest housing discrimination settlements in Maryland history and used every dollar of it to expand the program that Kenneth tried to destroy. This is the story of what happens when racism meets a man who survived worse than you could ever throw at him. Before we get into it, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. I love seeing where this community tunes in from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because this is a channel that tells stories that need to be told, stories that expose injustice, hold power accountable, and remind us that sometimes the camera catches everything. Let's get into it. Marcus Williams joined the Navy at 19 with one goal: to become a SEAL. Not for the glory or the reputation, because he'd grown up watching his father struggle with what was then called shell shock from Vietnam, and he wanted to understand what his father had survived. What it took to make it through. What it took to come home. He made it through basic underwater demolition / SEAL training on his first try. One of only 18 in his class of 140 to graduate. Spent 15 years on active duty, 3 combat tours, Iraq twice, Afghanistan once. Earned 2 Bronze Stars for valor, the second one for pulling 3 wounded Marines out of an ambush under sustained fire in Helmand Province. He came home in 2022 with an honorable discharge, a shelf full of commendations, and the same thing his father had carried for 40 years. Trauma that didn't go away just because the war was over. But Marcus had something his father didn't. He had access to therapy, to VA resources, to people who understood what combat does to you when the adrenaline stops and the silence starts. It saved his life. And once he stabilized, once he learned how to live with it instead of against it, he realized how many others were still drowning. Anchor Point started small. 6 guys meeting in Marcus's living room once a week. No paperwork, no funding, just veterans who needed a place where they didn't have to explain why they couldn't sleep, why loud noises made them flinch, why some days felt like they were still overseas even though they'd been home for years. Within a year, it became a registered 501c3 nonprofit. Marcus got his clinical social work license specializing in combat trauma. Anchor Point started offering structured group therapy, one-on-one sessions, crisis intervention. By the time May 2024 rolled around, they were serving 47 veterans regularly, 12 of them formerly homeless, now in stable housing that Marcus had helped them find. Ray Jackson was one of those 12. Army veteran, 2 tours in Iraq, came home in 2011 with a Purple Heart and a PTSD diagnosis the VA kept mismanaging. By 2023, he was living out of his car, bouncing between shelters, one bad week away from disappearing entirely. Marcus found him at a VA outreach event, got him into Anchor Point, helped him navigate the housing assistance system, and 6 months later, Ray had an apartment 3 blocks from the building where Marcus lived. Tommy Chen was a Marine, lost his left leg below the knee to an IED outside Kandahar, came home, got his prosthetic, went through months of physical therapy, and still couldn't figure out why he felt like a stranger in his own life. Anchor Point gave him the space to process that, to talk to people who understood what it meant to be angry at a body that didn't work the way it used to, angry at a country that thanked you for your service and then acted like you should be fine now. Marcus didn't do this for recognition. He did it because he knew what it felt like to be one bad night away from not making it, and he knew that the only thing that kept him here was having people who got it, who didn't ask him to explain, who just sat with him in the dark until the sun came up. That's what Anchor Point was. A room where veterans could sit with each other and not have to be okay. Where being broken wasn't a failure. Where showing up was enough. And on May 18th, 2024, at 7:30 p.m., 6 of those veterans were walking into Marcus's building for their weekly session when Kenneth Brennan decided they looked like criminals. Kenneth Brennan had been watching Marcus for 3 months. Not because Marcus had done anything wrong. Marcus paid rent on time, kept the apartment clean, didn't cause noise complaints. But Kenneth didn't like the foot traffic. Different people showing up on Saturday evenings. Some of them looked rough. Older guys, some with visible scars, one with a prosthetic leg Kenneth had seen through the hallway camera. They'd arrive between 7 and 7:30, stay for 2 hours, then leave. Kenneth had asked Marcus about it once, casually, in the parking lot. Marcus told him it was a veteran support group, that he ran a nonprofit helping guys transition back to civilian life. Kenneth nodded, said that sounded good, and then went back to his office and started documenting every person who walked into that apartment. He told himself it was about safety, about protecting the other tenants. But the truth, the part Kenneth would never say out loud, even to himself, was that he didn't like the idea of a black man having that many people coming and going. Didn't trust it. Assumed there had to be something else happening. On May 18th, Kenneth was in the building doing a walkthrough when he saw Ray Jackson and Tommy Chen enter the lobby. Ray was carrying a duffel bag, the kind veterans use because old habits die hard. Tommy was in a hoodie and jeans, prosthetic visible below the pant leg. They nodded at Kenneth as they passed. He didn't nod back. He followed them down the hallway at a distance, watched them knock on Marcus's door, watched Marcus let them in. Then he stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, and made a decision. He walked back to his office and called 911, told the dispatcher there was suspicious activity in one of the units, that he'd seen multiple individuals entering and exiting with bags, that he believed narcotics were involved, and that he needed officers to respond. The dispatcher asked if he'd witnessed drug activity directly. Kenneth hesitated, then said he had reason to believe it, based on the pattern of behavior. The dispatcher logged the call. 2 units were dispatched. Kenneth went back to the hallway and waited. At 7:32 p.m., 2 more veterans arrived, both black men in their 40s, one in a VA hospital t-shirt. Kenneth stepped out from around the corner and told them to stop, asked where they were going. One of them said they were visiting a friend. Kenneth asked which unit. The man gestured toward Marcus's door. Kenneth told them they needed to wait, that the police were on their way. The man blinked and asked why the police were coming. Kenneth didn't answer, just repeated that they needed to wait in the hallway. Marcus heard the raised voices and opened his door. Saw Kenneth blocking 2 of his guys in the hallway. Asked what was going on. Kenneth turned to him and said they were going to sort this out when the officers arrived. Marcus asked what exactly they were sorting out. Kenneth said he'd made a report about suspicious activity and that everyone needed to stay where they were until police cleared it. Marcus went still. His voice dropped. He asked Kenneth if he just called the cops on a PTSD support group. Kenneth said he didn't know what it was, that he'd seen enough to have concerns. Marcus asked what concerns. What had Kenneth seen that justified calling armed officers to a building full of combat veterans? Kenneth said he didn't need to explain himself, that this was his property and he had a right to ensure tenant safety. That's when Tommy stepped into the doorway behind Marcus, prosthetic leg visible, and said, calmly but loud enough for Kenneth to hear, that he'd lost his leg serving this country and couldn't believe he was being treated like a criminal for going to therapy. Kenneth's face flushed. He told Tommy not to make this about that that this wasn't personal. Marcus said it was absolutely personal, that Kenneth had watched black men and assumed criminality, that he'd called police without evidence, without cause, and now 6 veterans, some of them dealing with severe PTSD, were about to be surrounded by armed officers because Kenneth couldn't imagine they were doing anything legal. Kenneth started to respond, then stopped, because sirens were getting closer. And Marcus wasn't backing down, wasn't raising his voice, wasn't giving Kenneth anything to use against him, just standing there, arms crossed, waiting. At 7:41 p.m., officers Rebecca Martinez and Jake Morrison arrived at the building. Kenneth met them in the lobby, told them he was the property manager, and led them upstairs. Told them there were multiple individuals in Unit 2C engaged in what he believed was drug-related activity. Officer Martinez asked if he'd seen drugs. Kenneth said no, but the pattern was consistent with dealing. Martinez asked what pattern. Kenneth described the foot traffic, the duffel bags, the late hours. Martinez and Morrison exchanged a glance. Then they went upstairs. When they turned the corner into the hallway, they saw Marcus standing at his apartment door. 4 men behind him in the doorway, 2 more standing near Kenneth. All of them calm, all of them watching. Martinez immediately recognized what she was looking at. Not a drug operation. A group of veterans who'd just been racially profiled by their landlord and were now being confronted by police for existing. She stepped forward, kept her hands visible, and asked Marcus if they could talk. Officer Rebecca Martinez had been doing this long enough to know when a call didn't add up. Suspicious activity with no actual evidence. Property manager visibly agitated. Group of calm, older men who didn't look or act like they were doing anything illegal. And the moment she made eye contact with Marcus Williams, she saw it. The flat, controlled expression of someone who'd been here before, who knew exactly how this could go wrong. She introduced herself, asked Marcus if she could speak with him for a moment. Marcus said sure, but asked if she minded explaining why she was there. Martinez said they'd received a call about possible narcotics activity. Marcus asked who made the call. Martinez glanced at Kenneth. Marcus nodded slowly, then told her he ran a nonprofit PTSD support group for combat veterans and that this was their weekly meeting, that everyone in the hallway was a veteran, that there were no drugs, no crime, just therapy. Martinez asked if he had documentation for the nonprofit. Marcus said he did. Walked calmly into his apartment, came back 30 seconds later with a folder containing the 501c3 determination letter, his clinical social work license, and a participant roster with VA contact info for verification. Martinez took the folder, flipped through it, and handed it to Morrison. She looked at Kenneth and asked if he'd seen any actual drug activity. Kenneth said no, but the behavior was consistent with it. Martinez asked what behavior specifically. Kenneth gestured vaguely toward the group and said, the traffic, the hours, the type of people. Martinez went quiet for a second, then asked Kenneth what he meant by the type of people. Kenneth stammered, said he didn't mean it like that he just meant the volume of visitors. Tommy Chen, still standing in the doorway, said quietly that they were veterans and asked if that was a problem. Kenneth said of course not, but that didn't mean he couldn't have legitimate concerns about building security. Officer Morrison asked Marcus if all the men present were veterans. Marcus said yes. Morrison asked if anyone had a problem with him verifying that. Nobody did. Morrison called dispatch and requested a supervisor to the scene, not for backup, but because he realized this situation was about to become a formal complaint and he wanted a senior officer present. At 7:58 p.m., Sergeant David Hall arrived. Hall was a 20-year veteran of Montgomery County PD and a Gulf War Marine. He walked into that hallway, saw 6 men standing quietly with their hands visible, saw a landlord looking defensive, and saw 2 officers clearly trying to de-escalate something that never should have been escalated in the first place. Then he saw Marcus. Hall had never met Marcus personally, but he knew who he was. Anchor Point had a reputation in the Maryland veteran community. Hall had referred 2 guys to the program himself. He stopped mid-step, looked at Marcus, and said his name as a question. Marcus nodded. Hall looked at Kenneth and asked what the hell was going on. Martinez explained the call. Landlord reported narcotics activity, no evidence, turns out it's a veteran therapy group. Hall asked Kenneth directly whether he had seen drugs. Kenneth said no. Hall asked if he'd seen anything illegal. Kenneth said no, but he had concerns. Hall asked what those concerns were based on. Kenneth said the pattern of activity. Hall asked what pattern? Different people coming and going? At a therapy group? Kenneth said it was more than that. Hall asked him to be specific. Kenneth couldn't. Hall turned to Marcus and asked if he was okay. Marcus said he was fine, but wanted to know if this was going to be a regular thing, whether he needed to expect police showing up every time his group met. Hall said absolutely not, that he'd be filing a report documenting the call and the lack of probable cause, that Kenneth had wasted department resources and put veterans at risk by calling armed officers into a PTSD therapy session. Kenneth tried to say he had a right to protect his property. Hall cut him off, told him that calling 911 to report suspected drug activity when you have zero evidence isn't protecting property, it's harassment, and doing it to a group of veterans made it worse. Marcus asked Hall if he could file a formal complaint. Hall said yes and told him he'd email him the report number by end of shift. Then he looked at the other veterans, asked if anyone needed medical or if anyone's PTSD had been triggered by the confrontation. One of the men said he was shaking but would be okay. Hall gave him his card and told him to call if he needed anything. Then Hall turned back to Kenneth and said if he ever called in another false report like this, he'd be looking at charges. Kenneth opened his mouth to argue. Hall didn't let him, just told him to leave the hallway. Kenneth left. The officers stayed for another 10 minutes taking statements. Martinez apologized to Marcus directly, said she was sorry he'd been put in that position. Marcus said it wasn't her fault and that she'd handled it well. She said that didn't make it right. After the officers cleared the scene, the veterans went inside, sat down in Marcus's living room, and for the first 20 minutes of group that night, nobody talked about therapy. They talked about what had just happened, about how it felt to serve your country and still be treated like a threat, about how exhausting it was to be calm, to be cooperative, to do everything right and still end up surrounded by cops. Marcus let them talk, let them be angry, and when the room finally went quiet, he told them something he'd learned a long time ago. That surviving combat didn't mean the fight was over, that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones you fought just trying to live in the country you'd protected. But he also told them this, that they weren't alone, that they had each other, and that what Kenneth had tried to do, shut them down, scare them off, make them disappear, wasn't going to work, because they'd survived worse, and they weren't going anywhere. What Marcus didn't know yet was that Linda Vasquez, a tenant on the 3rd floor, had filmed the entire hallway confrontation from her doorway. That she'd posted it to social media at 9:47 p.m. with the caption, "Landlord calls cops on Black Navy SEAL running PTSD group for vets." Guess what happened? And that by the time Marcus woke up the next morning, the video had 2 million views. By 8 a.m. on May 19th, Linda's video had 5 million views. By noon, it was everywhere. Reposted by veteran advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, local news accounts. Every major outlet in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area had picked it up. The Washington Post ran a piece. NPR covered it. CNN played the clip on air during their afternoon segment on housing discrimination. The video was clean. Clear audio, stable footage, every word audible. You could see Kenneth blocking the hallway. You could see Marcus standing calm at his door. You could hear Kenneth say he'd called the police. You could hear Tommy mention his prosthetic leg and his service. You could see Sergeant Hall arrive and shut Kenneth down on camera. There was no ambiguity, no missing context. It was exactly what it looked like. A landlord racially profiling a black veteran and calling police on a PTSD support group. Marcus woke up to 400 missed calls, 1,200 texts, and his phone literally crashing from notifications. He didn't know the video existed until his sister called him at 7:30 a.m. and told him to check social media immediately. He watched it twice. Then he sat on the edge of his bed for 10 minutes, trying to process that the worst moment of his week was now being seen by millions of people. That his face, his voice, his apartment building were now public. That he'd become the story. At 10 a.m., Montgomery County PD released a statement confirming officers had responded to a call at the building, that no criminal activity was found, and that the matter was under review. At 11:30 a.m., the property management company that employed Kenneth issued a statement saying they were aware of the incident and conducting an internal investigation. By 2 p.m., Kenneth Brennan's name, photo, and employment history were circulating online. People found his LinkedIn, his social media, photos of him at company events. Someone dug up a Yelp review from 2021 where a former tenant, a Latino family, Sadiestis, had accused him of harassment and intimidation. Another former tenant came forward saying Kenneth had threatened to call immigration on them despite them being U.S. citizens. The pattern was emerging, and it wasn't just one bad night. It was years of behavior that had been ignored, dismissed, or covered up by a system that didn't care until a video forced them to. At 4:47 p.m. on May 19th, Marcus's phone rang. It was a reporter from the Washington Post asking for an interview. Marcus declined. Then NPR called, then ABC, then a dozen others. Marcus turned his phone off. But he couldn't turn off what was happening, because by the evening of May 19th, Kenneth's property management company had received over 10,000 emails demanding his termination. The building ownership had been contacted by 3 separate law firms offering to represent tenants in a class action suit. And Anchor Point's donation page, which Marcus had barely promoted, had received $47,000 in contributions from people who'd seen the video and wanted to support the program Kenneth had tried to destroy. On May 20th, Marcus drove to a law office in Bethesda, the same attorney who'd represented Alicia Brooks, James Whitfield, had reached out through a veteran advocacy network and offered to take Marcus's case pro bono. Whitfield had read the incident report, watched the video, and told Marcus flat out that this was one of the clearest housing discrimination cases he'd seen in 2 decades. Marcus didn't want money. He wanted accountability. He wanted Kenneth Brennan to never be able to do this to another tenant again. And he wanted the property management company to explain how someone with Kenneth's history had been allowed to keep working. Whitfield told him they'd get all of that. But it would take time. It would be public. And it would mean reliving that night over and over through depositions, filings, and media coverage. Marcus said he'd survived worse. And if going through this meant the next veteran didn't have to, he was in. On May 22nd, Whitfield filed a federal lawsuit naming Kenneth Brennan and the property management company as defendants. The complaint was 31 pages. It detailed the May 18th incident, the prior tenant complaints against Kenneth, the company's failure to investigate, and the pattern of racial profiling that had been allowed to continue for years. 2 days later, on May 24th, Kenneth Brennan was terminated. The company issued a statement saying his actions violated their policies and values and that he was no longer employed in any capacity. His wife filed for divorce the same week, not out of principle, but to protect their shared assets from the lawsuit. By the end of May, the video had 40 million combined views. Marcus had been invited to speak at veteran events, advocacy panels, and police training seminars. Anchor Point had a 6-month wait list. And Kenneth Brennan had become a cautionary tale about what happens when you racially profile someone who has both the receipts and the platform to make sure the world knows what you did. The discovery phase of Marcus Williams versus Kenneth Brennan began in July 2024. James Whitfield's team requested all tenant complaints filed against Kenneth over the previous 5 years. All communications between Kenneth and building ownership regarding Marcus or Anchor Point, and all documentation related to Kenneth's training on fair housing law and anti-discrimination policies. What came back was worse than expected. Kenneth had 17 formal complaints filed against him over 5 years. 11 involved tenants of color. 8 specifically mentioned racial bias or discriminatory behavior. 1 was from a Muslim family who said Kenneth had interrogated them about their religion and implied they were a security threat. Another was from a black single mother who said Kenneth had threatened to call child services when her kids played too loud in the hallway. None of the complaints had resulted in discipline. Most hadn't been investigated at all. The property management company had a policy on paper that required supervisors to review all tenant complaints within 10 business days. In practice, Kenneth's supervisor had signed off on complaint closures without interviewing anyone involved. Whitfield's associate found an email from 2022 where Kenneth had written to his supervisor saying he was concerned about the demographic changes in the building and whether it was affecting property values. The supervisor had responded that they'd discuss it offline. There was no record of any follow-up or corrective action. When Kenneth sat for his deposition in August, Whitfield walked him through every complaint, asked him whether he remembered each one. Kenneth claimed he didn't recall most of them. Whitfield showed him his own emails. Kenneth said he'd been doing his job and that tenant complaints were part of property management. Whitfield asked him why he'd called the police on Marcus without evidence. Kenneth said he'd had reasonable suspicion based on the pattern of activity. Whitfield asked what was suspicious about veterans attending a therapy group. Kenneth said he didn't know it was a therapy group at the time. Whitfield asked why he didn't just ask Marcus what the meetings were for. Kenneth said he didn't need to ask permission to ensure building safety. Whitfield asked him if he'd called the police on any white tenants for having regular visitors. Kenneth said he couldn't recall. Whitfield produced building entry logs showing 3 white tenants who'd had similar or higher foot traffic during the same period. Kenneth had never called police on any of them. Whitfield asked him directly whether race had been a factor in his decision to call 911 on Marcus. Kenneth said no. Whitfield asked him to explain why 11 of his 17 complaints involved tenants of color if race wasn't a factor in how he managed the building. Kenneth said that was a coincidence. Whitfield let that sit in the room for about 10 seconds. Then he moved on. In October, the Maryland Real Estate Commission opened an investigation into Kenneth's property management license based on the lawsuit findings. In November, after reviewing the deposition transcripts and tenant complaint history, they voted unanimously to revoke his license permanently. Kenneth would never manage another property in Maryland. Meanwhile, the property management company was trying to settle. They'd seen the video, they'd read the discovery documents, they knew how bad this looked. Their attorney contacted Whitfield in September and asked what it would take to resolve the case. Whitfield said Marcus wanted 3 things: financial compensation for the harm caused, a public apology acknowledging the racial profiling and the company's failure to act on prior complaints, and mandatory reforms, including third-party oversight of tenant complaints, annual fair housing training for all property managers, and a public reporting system so tenants could see how complaints were being handled. The company agreed to everything. The settlement finalized in January 2025, $2,100,000. A formal public statement acknowledging that Marcus had been racially profiled and that the company had failed in its duty to investigate prior complaints, and a consent decree requiring the company to implement the reforms Marcus had demanded, with annual reporting to a court-appointed monitor for 3 years. Marcus signed the agreement on January 14, 2025. The same day, he announced that 100% of the settlement, every dollar, would go toward expanding Anchor Point, 3 new locations across Maryland, full-time staff, a 24/7 crisis line for veterans in PTSD episodes, rent assistance for homeless vets trying to get stable housing. The program Kenneth had tried to shut down was now funded for the next decade. Marcus didn't take a salary from the settlement. He didn't buy a new car or a bigger apartment. He put every dollar into Anchor Point and built something that would outlast him. By March 2025, Anchor Point had 4 locations: Silver Spring, Bethesda, Rockville, and Baltimore. Each one staffed with licensed therapists who specialized in combat trauma, each one running multiple group sessions per week, plus one-on-one counseling, plus family therapy for vets whose PTSD was affecting their marriages and their kids. The 24/7 crisis line launched in April. In its first 6 months, it fielded over 800 calls. 17 of those calls were from veterans in active crisis: suicidal ideation, severe flashbacks, complete breakdowns. Every single one of them was connected to immediate support. Every single one of them survived. Ray Jackson, the Army vet who'd been homeless when Marcus found him, became Anchor Point's outreach coordinator. He spent his days connecting with veterans living on the streets, in shelters, in cars, bringing them into the program, getting them into housing. In the first year after the settlement, Anchor Point helped 34 homeless veterans get stable housing. Ray knew what that meant because he'd been one of them. Tommy Chen started speaking at veteran events, told his story, losing his leg, struggling with PTSD, finding Anchor Point, being racially profiled in a hallway while just trying to get help. His story became part of the national conversation about how veterans are treated when they come home. He spoke at the VA, at military bases, at police academies, and every time he ended the same way. by saying that if Marcus hadn't built this program, he didn't know if he'd still be here. Marcus was invited to join the Maryland governor's task force on veteran housing and mental health. He consulted with the Montgomery County Police Department on how to train officers to recognize and de-escalate situations involving veterans with PTSD. He worked with landlords and property managers on fair housing compliance and how to avoid the kind of assumptions Kenneth had made. Kenneth Brennan, meanwhile, never worked in property management again. His license was gone. His reputation was destroyed. His wife had left him. He tried to appeal the settlement, claiming he'd been unfairly targeted. The appeal was dismissed. He moved out of Maryland entirely in late 2025. Nobody in the veteran community knew where he went, and nobody cared. Linda Vasquez, the tenant who filmed the confrontation, stayed in the building under new management. She got a personal thank you from Marcus and a lifetime free membership to Anchor Point's family support program if she ever needed it. She said she didn't regret posting the video, that some things needed to be seen. That silence protected people like Kenneth, and she wasn't going to be silent. Sergeant David Hall retired from Montgomery County PD in 2026 after 22 years. He joined Anchor Point's board of directors and helped design the police training program Marcus was building. He said the May 18th call was one of the most important responses of his career. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. Because he and his officers recognized what they were walking into and didn't make it worse. As of early 2026, Anchor Point serves over 200 veterans annually. The program has a 91% retention rate, meaning once veterans start coming, they keep coming. The crisis line has fielded over 1,500 calls, and the housing assistance program has helped 58 formerly homeless veterans get stable, permanent housing. Marcus still runs group sessions every Saturday night, still sits in a circle with guys who've seen combat and can't sleep and don't know how to talk about it with anyone who wasn't there, still reminds them that showing up is enough, that being broken isn't failure, that they're not alone. And every time he sits down in that circle, he thinks about May 18th, about Kenneth Brennan trying to shut them down, about the police showing up, about how close it came to going differently, about how one video, one lawsuit, one settlement turned the worst night of that year into the thing that saved the program. He doesn't call it justice. He calls it accountability. And he says there's a difference. Justice would be a world where Kenneth never called the cops in the first place, where veterans didn't have to prove they weren't criminals just for existing, where coming home from war didn't mean fighting a new battle just to be treated like a human being. But accountability is what happens when someone abuses power and it costs them everything. When the system that protected them for years finally stops. When the people they try to destroy become the ones who decide what happens next. And in that hallway on May 18th, 2024, Kenneth Brennan picked the wrong man. He picked a Navy SEAL who'd survived 3 combat tours, who'd built a program out of nothing, who'd helped dozens of veterans stay alive when the VA couldn't, who had the documentation, the platform, the resources, and the will to make sure Kenneth never did this again. That's what $2.1 million bought. Not revenge, not comfort. A future where the next veteran didn't have to fight alone. If this story hit you, share it. Not just because Marcus won or because Kenneth got what he deserved, but because there are hundreds of programs like Anchor Point that exist because one person decided to do something. One person who survived hell and came back and said, I'm going to make sure the next person doesn't have to go through this alone. Marcus didn't ask for that confrontation. He didn't ask to be racially profiled. He didn't ask for his worst moment to be seen by 40 million people. But when it happened, he didn't just survive it. He used it. He turned it into something that would outlast the pain. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Not the lawsuit, not the settlement. The 14 years before that night, when Marcus was building something that mattered. The quiet work. The veterans he helped when nobody was watching. The crisis calls he answered at 2 a.m. The guy he pulled out of a car and got into housing. That's the story. Drop a comment below. Have you or someone you know ever had an encounter with law enforcement that felt wrong? Or tell me, what would you have done if you were Marcus in that moment? I read every single comment, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this is a channel that tells stories that need to be told. Stories that expose injustice, hold power accountable, and remind us that sometimes the camera catches everything. Don't miss the next one.